Let's first of all delve a little bit into your own journey that brought you to the family enterprise conversation, which is a very personal journey because you actually were supposed to be, I guess, the next gen of a quite significant family legacy. And you happen to be the generation that sort of got the shorter end of the stick there because your predecessors decided to put an end to the enterprise. So tell us a little bit more about that experience.
My father, who was a son-in-law, who had graduated Yale Law School, he was quite intelligent. He was young. He had already served in the Navy, and he hated practicing law. So he went in and joined the family business, and principally became an account executive, selling an inferior line of men's suits that they created under their own label. And unfortunate set of circumstances, upon the birth of my mother's third child, which was me, my dad had a heart attack and was in the hospital. And he got well. A couple of years later, they went on vacation. They went to Greece, and he had a second heart attack. And this time it didn't fare so well. And as I was described to me, in 1960, my dad came back from Greece to New York in a box. Very traumatic, very life-changing set of circumstances. And now the family business has got one son from one of the brothers who was kind of the bean counter of the three brothers. He wasn't the break down the doors entrepreneur. And then one other son-in-law who was so young, mid to late 20s, that I think the writing was on the wall at that point was, for this company to continue, there would have to be a strong next generation leader. And so the story, as I've researched it, was that in 1969, when my grandfather was 70 and his older brother was probably 72, they sold the business. Now, what's very unusual was they were given lifetime employment contracts. And so they continued to run the business out of a showroom and executive offices in the middle of Manhattan in the Rockefeller Center building. So I really grew up in a very fortunate set of circumstances, but I would have loved to have been part of that family business and that legacy. And so I always felt a kinship with the business and was always interested in the notion that there was a family business. So you can see that the influence of my grandfather was pretty strong in my life. Being of another generation where I wasn't driven by economic circumstances, I didn't have to go out on the streets of New York City and peddle anything. And I could go out and kind of find my own path. And that's what I did. I moved to California when I was 20 because I had a certain amount of financial freedom already. And I wanted to explore what life would be like on the other side of the United States.
My first question to you here, Jonathan, really about if we're going to get into the whole successor discussion here, do you really think the motivation has to be the same though? Isn't it actually also a healthy evolution that not every generation should have to come from this survival and this fear of poverty?
I've had incredible freedom, and I've always struggled yet with feeling confident enough and successful enough. And I think I struggled with something that I only recognized and was told about after I published my book, which is called the imposter syndrome. And you might be familiar with it,
Very
where
familiar.
where you don't feel like you're good enough or you're worthy enough. And so I've been a business coach now since 2004. So that's 18 years, right? Or 19 or whatever. And then I was a business consultant for another 13 years before that. So, I mean, do the math. It's over 30 years of experience. I have my confidence now, but it wasn't probably until just the last couple of years where I really feel like I've blossomed with a book, with a podcast, with getting better clients and bigger clients and having more success stories. And I think my grandfather, he had a sense of self-confidence that was oftentimes buoyed up probably by his brothers and by the success of that business and by their circumstances drove them to become self-made and successful. And I've had to redefine success.
Do you think it would have been different for you if that feeling, like if you felt like, if the business had still been there and if maybe by experience you would have realized, well, I tried it, I didn't like it, and you would have then started your own career? Do you feel like that sense of not knowing had an
Wow.
impact?
I have no idea what might have happened if the business was still going and I was involved in it. I mean, I'm hardwired, at least now, to be thinking I would have gone off on my own, but I
Mhm.
might have been an obnoxious, spoiled brat who, who felt, you know, that I don't know, that who felt that my success was just everything that was around me. I've seen some next gens of successful family business people who are marginally involved with the business and are buoyed up by the success of the social trappings they've grown up in. And I've seen others who didn't take it that way and were not involved and felt like there was maybe always a competition to participate.
How do you feel we could potentially start changing that conversation for next gens? What's your stance on this in lightening that burden?
I think that rising gen, next generation leaders, and I'm principally in my mind picturing millennials 25 to 40, but because it's much harder, by the way, Rami, if that next generation of a successful family business person is 50 to 60 years old, and they're dealing with a 70 to 80-year-old parent who's still actively engaged and involved in the business. I only really like to coach like the 40 and under because it's more difficult to coach older people. They're slower to change. But I think that if the question is in my mind is how do they get to feel like they deserve their place in the business? And I think if I'm hearing the question correctly, I think the answer is they have to earn it. It sounds kind of Darwinian because it sounds like you're basically going to be firing some of the old people, and maybe it's because they can't learn the technology or they can't get the culture piece right, or maybe they're not really as productive as we thought they were, and suddenly they have to be accountable and maybe to a different set of metrics, including which might be measured using some sort of technology tool. I mean, it's difficult, I think, because a successor who's really disruptive has got an enormous burden on their shoulders to do it right and to do it right by all the stakeholders. And that includes their parents.
So, how do you raise kids in that environment in a way that they feel like, I love it, I want it to last, but I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to, like, how do you suggest like parents do that?
I think the parents' responsibility is to provide quality time in their children's lives. This could be done at the dinner table and to be a mentor and to be instructive. What I think the mistake is that I would imagine happens too much is that the child is caught up in what I would call a lot of tactical thinking and decision making. And so they'll become very proficient in understanding tactically how to think through problems. But to really nurture an entrepreneurial spirit in your child, you're going to have to teach them to be more strategic. They got to understand finances for sure, which oftentimes is not a subject that's taught anywhere remotely in schools or anything, right? They're going to have to be taught to think strategically about the market and the markets and competition and where things are going so they see big picture conversations and that they see the parents solving or hear of the parents solving big picture challenges instead of being, seeing it as a blocker and getting stuck behind it. And then lastly, I think that a child needs to be given certain personal strategies for success. And that, to me, is around health, mental health, physical health, emotional health, like fitness, well-being, and exposure to diverse groups of people, diverse thinking. That's your job as a parent, I think, is to let them stand on your shoulders until they're old enough, strong enough, large enough to stand on their own.